What's the story, everyone? Welcome back to Gaelic Games Fan TV. I hope the form is good. I hope the form is well. So the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship is officially concluded. The Football Championship is officially concluded now as well. We know what has happened in both championships, and we know obviously how the season has gone for every county in both the Hurling and the Football Championship. And over the next couple of days, I'm going to be making two videos on this channel. Obviously, one grading all the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship sides based on their performance in the Hurling League and in the Hurling Championship. And we're going to be doing the same in the Football Championship as well. So stay tuned for the football video. That'll be out in the next couple of days. But for today, we're going to be focusing on the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship and obviously the league as well. We'll be judging every side's performance in both the league and the Hurling Championship, grading them from A to F based on how they got on this year. Now, for long-term subscribers on the channel, you probably would have seen me make content like this obviously last year. Usually I would have done it in a podcast style format with one of the lads, and we would have obviously discussed every team and gone through every team in great detail. The only thing is, a lot of those podcasts tend to go on for absolute ages. Like, I remember the football one we did last year went on for nearly 2 hours, and I just don't think anyone's really going to sit there and listen to a 2-hour podcast. It's probably a bit too long to listen to myself, in fairness. So I'm just going to record it myself, pre-record it, so I can edit it and chop it here and there and make the video a little bit more quick and a little bit more fast. And yeah, for people who don't know, like, what I'll be doing is, so I'll be grading every county from the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship from A to F. We will be looking at the Joe McDonagh Cup sides as well, and we will be obviously judging their seasons from the Hurling League and the Championship. Basically their overall performance in 2023 as an inter-county side. Obviously the league isn't that important in hurling, and like, you nearly forget the league even happened in hurling. Like, it's very irrelevant, and I really wish they'd kind of change it going into next year, but I suppose it is what it is. And to be fair, there were some good moments obviously in the league. Limerick winning the league, to be fair, they usually give everyone else a chance in the league, but they actually went and won that this year. And look, with these grades, like, obviously, I do want to explain just a little bit how they work first of all, so people sort of don't get confused. So obviously different teams would have had different expectations at the start of the year. Obviously we don't know for certain what every team's objectives or goals were at the start of every season. Obviously the managers and the players very much know that, but we can speculate and we can judge off what the objective was. For example, Limerick's objective was pretty clear: win the All-Ireland and win the Munster Championship. Like, that was clearly their objective, and anything short of that, you could say would have been somewhat of a failure of a season in many ways. It wouldn't have been an out-and-out failure, like, do you know what I mean? Like, they wouldn't have got an F in my opinion, had they have lost in the final. But that's generally more or less how it works. Like Antrim, for example, like, their expectations and goals would have been so much different to a team like Tipperary or Waterford. Like, Tipperary and Waterford are going for big titles. Like, they want to be going for the Munster Championship. They want to be competing for the All-Ireland. Whereas the likes of your Antrim and Westmeath would have had completely different goals and completely different expectations at the start of the season than those counties. So that's what the grades are very much based off. Like, if a team probably doesn't progress and stays sort of as is from last year, you'd probably give them a C. If there's been slight progression, you give them a B. And if there's been a huge amount of progression and ultimately the best possible season that particular county could have, we give them an A. And obviously anything, regression-wise or a bad season or anything like that, you go below C compared to what they were expecting to achieve at the start of the year. Hopefully that clears things up, because sometimes in these videos, you could give a side a B and another side a D. It doesn't necessarily mean that, the first team that gets a B is better than the other team. It just means that they had a better season compared to what they were expected to achieve at the start of the year. So hopefully anyway that clears things up. So yeah, we'll be looking at the All-Ireland Championship teams, and then we'll be looking at the Joe McDonagh Cup teams a little bit later. So we'll start off with the Leinster Senior Hurling Championship, and we'll go in alphabetical order, which starts us off with Antrim. Now Antrim, as we know, stayed up in both the Leinster Senior Hurling Championship and they stayed up in the league as well. It's a tough one, this, because I'm very much torn between an A and a B. Like, I think ultimately for Antrim, I think their goal at the start of the season would have been to stay in the league and to stay in the Leinster Championship. Do you know that way? Like, I think had they been relegated, I think there definitely would have been a regression. So, like, it's kind of a tough one here, like, because you could argue an A, but they didn't, like, I think if they had been relegated from the Championship, you probably would have given a D, maybe a C. So I think to jump them from a C to an A straight away just because they avoided relegation, I think is a bit too far. ultimately, in my opinion. Like, I think they competed very well. They drew at Dublin. They obviously beat Westmeath on the final day. They beat Laois in the league as well to stay up. Ultimately, they only won 2 inter-county games all year, but when you look at the teams they had to compete with, obviously in the Leinster Championship, playing against Kilkenny, Galway, very tough for them, in fairness, and they nearly took a scalp off Wexford as well. Conal Cunning was outstanding for the majority of the season, and Neil McManus has obviously since announced his retirement. So I'm going to give Antrim a solid B. Some people might say that's a bit harsh. Like, could Antrim have done any more realistically than what they done? Maybe not, but I do look at Westmeath getting a result against Wexford. I think Antrim had Dublin on the ropes and could have beaten them. I think it could have been more comfortable for Antrim, and I actually think they could have been closer to getting out of Leinster than even being in a relegation battle. So I'll give Antrim a B, a solid season. Definitely still a bit more in this Antrim side in my opinion. But look, they achieved what they set out to, which was stay in Division 1 and stay in the Leinster Championship. They done that. So all in all, a very solid season from the Saffron lads. Moving on to my own county, Dublin. Like, I give Dublin a C. Like, I think the season probably went more or less as expected, to be honest with you. Like, I don't think there was a huge amount of progression. I don't think there was really much regression either. I think they done more or less what they could do in the context of things. But I think from last season, like, there hasn't really been progression. Like, fair enough, last year we didn't get out of the Leinster Championship. We finished 4th, but we more or less had a similar season in the Leinster Championship. We beat Wexford, we failed to beat Galway, failed to beat Kilkenny. Like, it just more or less went the way I expected. And the fact we were beaten so badly against Clare, like, I don't even think Clare were at their absolute best that day, and they just wiped the floor with us. They really, really wiped the floor with us. And there were some good moments this year. Our performance against Galway was very good in the final day of the Leinster Championship. But equally, we had some disappointing days, like nearly got beat by Antrim, which would have been a huge disappointment. So for Dublin, like that, we're looking at some younger lads to really kind of come in now in the next few years, like Alex Considine, Dara Gray, these lads. You're looking at some of the younger players, Dara Purcell, to really kick in and hopefully be the future of Dublin hurling. There is a lot of great players at club level as well. Andrew Jameson Murphy is another one who stands out with Nafina. You were looking at the older guard, Ronan Hayes, Danny Sutcliffe. Just didn't see enough from them this year. And I think all in all, like, a quarter-final appearance, I think, is the best ultimately that we could have done. And yeah, like, it's a hard one now. Now that I think about it, I think a C probably is a bit harsh. Because could we, like, realistically, we're just not as good as Clare. And realistically, we're not as good as Kilkenny or Galway. So, I'll give Dublin a B. I think there certainly is room for improvement. There certainly is room for doing better. I think ultimately, like, we want to try be kicking on. We don't want to just be the easy side, the easy draw in the quarterfinal that teams face. But you can tell we're a million miles off, I'd say, the 5 counties in Munster and the other, Galway, Kilkenny. I think we're miles off them at the moment. I know we nearly beat Galway in the final day in Leinster, but I think Galway had their, they didn't need anything from that game essentially. So yeah, look, I'll give Dublin a B. Maybe being a bit harsh originally, but we'll give Dublin a B. Galway then is an interesting one again. Probably a similar fashion to Dublin in the sense that they had a very similar season to last year. I think there was moments they were a lot better this year, but ultimately, like, you definitely can't say there's been progression. So I think it's between a C and a D. They were moments away from beating Kilkenny, and that would have been a huge moment for Galway to get silverware. I was surprised they didn't take the league more seriously, because I think a chance at winning silverware and a chance at getting a crack at Limerick in a major final would have been huge for Galway. So I was surprised they didn't take the league more seriously. But I think at the same time for Galway, like, they did have some great moments this year, but ultimately they got beat very comfortably by Limerick, and they fluffed their lines in the big moment versus Kilkenny. So, like, between a C and a D, I think I'd probably go a C. Maybe that's being a bit generous. I think, like, ultimately, like, there hasn't really been any progression from last year. But could you say they regressed and they've gotten worse? I don't really think so either, because they were a lot closer to beating Kilkenny this year than last year. And to be fair, in that first half versus Limerick, they were doing so much right. And this Limerick side are just phenomenal, as we very much know. So, yeah, we'll go with a C for Galway. I think next year is a huge one for Henry. Year 3, if there is no improvement next year, I think you would argue that there needs to be possibly a change within Galway. But you would also say as well, is the talent there in Galway that's there in Kilkenny, Limerick? I don't think there is, to be honest with you, and even Clare. So yeah, we'll go with a C for Galway. Kilkenny then, I'm going to go for a B. Look, I think a side like Kilkenny to not win an All-Ireland, and obviously the expectations for Kilkenny, the history of Kilkenny, the most successful county in the history of the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship, they aspire to win All-Irelands. That is what they aim to do. Having been beaten in Limerick narrowly in the final, they would have looked at this season and thought anything short of winning the All-Ireland would have been not a failure, but it certainly, it would have been, they would have been dropping short of what they would have probably aiming for at the start of the season. But in saying that, I still think Kilkenny had a very solid season. They gave absolutely everything against Limerick in that final. Their intensity was unbelievable. TJ Reid was phenomenal in the game. Owen Cody was outstanding. Paddy Deegan, Tom Phelan has come on leaps and bounds. And when you think, for Derek Lyng, this was his first season as manager of Kilkenny, the man to obviously take over from the legendary Brian Cody, there was going to be a bit of a transition there. And I don't think a lot of people, even including me at the start of the year, expected... I thought Kilkenny would get to a semi-final, and then I thought they'd get beat, to be honest with you. At the start of the year, I did not expect them to go the entire way and get to an All-Ireland final, just because of the transition, the younger players coming in, some of the older guard aging, but the older guard have still been at it. Walter Walsh, Richie Hogan, TJ Reid as well, and some of the younger guard like Billy Drennan, Dara Corker and David Blanchfield have all looked fantastic at times for Kilkenny. So Kilkenny are in good stead going into the next couple of years. They're definitely not going anywhere. I give them a solid B. I think you could argue an A, because could they have really done more than what they gave? But I think at the same time, ultimately the objective and the aim for Kilkenny has to be to win an All-Ireland. With the team that they have, with the vision and the history of the county, I think they have to be aiming towards the All-Ireland. So I give them a B. A solid season for Kilkenny, a solid season for Derek Lyng. They're certainly not going anywhere, and I think they're going to be Limerick's closest team now over the next couple of years, without a shadow of a doubt. Westmeath then is an interesting one. They stayed up in Division 1. They lost every game in Division 1A, but they beat Laois in the relegation playoff. And then in the Leinster Championship, remember, they had that famous win against Wexford. What were they, 20 points down or something like that at half-time? Something remarkable, and they came back and won the game in what is one of the greatest comebacks in the history of hurling, in my opinion. That was just absolutely remarkable. But ultimately, for Westmeath, they had a very, very solid season, a great season, but I think ultimately they did get relegated, and I think that will be a disappointment. To beat Wexford and still go down, that definitely will hurt them ever so slightly. Back in the Joe McDonagh again. So I'll give them a B. You could argue an A because of that win versus Wexford. A phenomenal, phenomenal win. But I think ultimately that defeat to Antrim on the final day, ultimately, this is going to sound a bit harsh, but ultimately the win against Wexford in the end didn't really count for much because they still got relegated. To be fair, they were without Killian Dahl for the majority of the season, and they've had more or less the same panel for the last couple of years. Kieran Dahl's been excellent. Ronan Glennon obviously has been very good as well. Noel Mitchell has been another player coming off the bench making an impact. But I do think ultimately for Westmeath, to get relegated, I just can't justify giving them an A when they got relegated, even despite staying up in Division 1 and beating Wexford. But I think ultimately for Westmeath, it's been a phenomenal season, and I think in the Joe McDonagh Cup next year, they'll undoubtedly be the favourites. As for Wexford, we have our lowest grade so far, and that is a D. We could have justified giving them an F here. I mean, if they had lost to Kilkenny on the final day of the Leinster Championship, I think you would have had to have given them an F because they would have been relegated. For Wexford, it's just a D, isn't it? A very disappointing season overall. Obviously losing to Westmeath, like we said before, having been in front for so long, and I think you would arguably say that Wexford are more than capable of beating Westmeath when you look at how the season went in the end, and Wexford were cruising for large parts against Westmeath until that comeback happened. I'm hearing Dara Egan apparently is going to be leaving. I don't know if that's confirmed yet, but there's definitely rumours that he will be leaving. there just hasn't been progression. I think they've definitely gone backwards since Davy Fitz has left. They got to a quarter-final last year and played quite well against Galway, I think it was, in that quarter-final. Or Clare, actually. I think they played quite well that day. And they do have great players like Lee Chin. Cathal Dunbar has looked very good in club championships, looks like a very good player. They've got, Conor McDonald. They've got great hurlers, and they're not a million miles away from getting out of Leinster, in my opinion. I think they've got a good couple of underage players coming through. So they're not, I think with a good manager next year, they'll be back and they could very well get out of Leinster next season. But ultimately this year was just a massive disappointment. And the fact they produced that against Kilkenny on the final day to get that win, it's in many ways it's almost worse for Wexford, because they showed what they can do against the top team. I know Kilkenny had nothing to play for, but to show what they could do on that final game, and ultimately all it done was keep them in Leinster. It just goes to show how disappointing they were against Galway, against Dublin, the amount of wides they had. They were so flat that day in Croke Park, and the defeat to Westmeath. So I'll go with a D. The result against Kilkenny and the win against Kilkenny is ultimately, for me, what gets them a D. The league, they did pretty much nothing as well, to be fair. But we'll give them a D. That win, in my opinion, it prevents the F. It prevents it being an out and out failure. But it was a bad season for Wexford, no question about it. So we'll move on to the Munster Championship sides then, and we'll start with Cork. And yeah, Cork is a very difficult one, beaten in the semi-finals of the league by Kilkenny. I think the league most definitely was very disappointing from a Cork perspective. To lose in that semi-final to Kilkenny, Cork needs silverware, they need trophies, they need something. They've got a young bunch of players, and they've obviously got experience in there, like Patrick Horgan and a few other lads who've been knocking around for a while, Dara Fitzgibbon and a few others. But Cork they definitely had some moments this year. They drew with Tipperary, or they drew with Clare. I think they drew with Tipperary as well. Beat Waterford and lost to Limerick. They had a lot of good moments in the season, Cork. And to think there was a moment in that game against Limerick where Cork were beating Limerick, and if Cork had beaten Limerick in that game, I think Limerick would have been gone, and Limerick would have been completely out of championship. Imagine that as a sliding doors moment. I'm not saying Cork would have went on and had the season that Limerick had and won the All-Ireland, but they would have been in a Munster final, and I think even if they lost the Munster final, they would have beaten Dublin, they would have been in a semi-final. It's mad to think how just a couple of moments can completely change an outcome of a season. And look, for Cork, they did have injuries, and ultimately for their manager, and obviously Pat Ryan, obviously his first season in charge, I think Cork ultimately, even though they went out of Munster and their expectations, a county like Cork should be aspiring for more. With the underage that they have, they've got a very good panel, a huge amount of depth in their squad. They should be aspiring for more, obviously, than getting knocked out in Munster. But even when you look at their score difference, they were so close. They done so much right for so much large parts, and Tipperary had the hop early in the championship and got a lot of great results. Clare and Limerick, two of the best sides in the country, in my opinion. Limerick, one of the greatest sides of all time. So it's hard to really fault Cork. So I'm going to give them a C. I think it's weird because last year they were in a quarter-final, so you'd say they've regressed, but when you look at some of their performances, last year they were getting hammered at times in the Munster Championship, and they got hammered in the league final. This year they were far more competitive in a lot of their games. I think they've bulked through a lot more underage, the likes of Alan Connolly. Jack O'Connor has obviously come back in, a few others as well. So I think Cork are not a million miles away, and they could be a dangerous prospect next year if they can click. That's the thing with Cork, is that they've got so many pieces of the jigsaw, you're just waiting for them to click, and it just hasn't happened in the last couple of years. And will it happen next year? We'll have to wait and see. But I'll give Cork a C. Ultimately they'll be disappointed in some ways with their season, but I think at the same time they probably won't look back at this year in the same breath as some of the previous years. This is something I'd put to Cork fans, actually. And Cork fans can answer this in the questions down below. Are you more positive going into next year than you were going into 2022? And that might sound weird, because 2021 you were in the All-Ireland final and you were absolutely hammered by Limerick. But this time around you didn't even get out of Munster. But yeah, you were so much more competitive with Limerick, and Cork were very, very, they were only 1 or 2 points away from winning a lot of games. So ultimately, for Cork, like, it's a strange one. They're probably going in next year more positive than they were going in last year, having been in an All-Ireland final in 2021. It's a bit mad, isn't it? But that's the Munster Championship for you. So, yeah, we'll go with a C for Cork. Boys from Clare then. Clare, yeah, I think I have to go with a C here as well. I don't think there's been progression from last year, but I don't think they've gotten worse. I think there was moments, like you could argue, I think to be fair, they've been slightly better than last year, because obviously their performance in the semi-final this year was a lot better than the semi-final performance last year against Kilkenny. And they were very close, obviously. I suppose they were a lot better in the Munster final last year than this year, and they beat Limerick obviously in the round robin in the Gaelic rounds and everything else. So there probably has been a slight bit of progression. Obviously, Aidan McCarthy's come back. He was obviously injured for the semi-final against Kilkenny. Mark Rogers looks like a great up-and-coming talent in this Clare side as well. John Conlon's been phenomenal. We know the ability of Tony Kelly. So there probably has been slight progression, but I don't think it's enough to go from a C to a B. I'm going to be quite strict with these grades. Do you know what I'm saying? So we'll go with a C, I think, just for the fact that they still lost in a semi-final. They still lost in the Munster final. So, performances-wise, there probably has been an improvement, but ultimately, it hasn't changed the outcome of what happened last season. So, I'll go with a C for Clare. I don't think they're a million miles away. I think they just need to find a way to perform better in Croke Park, and they need to be a lot more accurate in front of goal, in my opinion. I think that's the key point. I would still think Kilkenny and Limerick are a good bit ahead of them going into next year, but I think Clare, they're not a million miles away. And if Limerick have an off day next year, or I don't see that happening, by the way, but if they completely just don't turn up, Clare could be a team to capitalise on it. But look, we'll go with a C for Clare. I don't know. Clare fans can answer me in the comments down below. Are you happy with this season? Ultimately, I think for Clare fans, they'll be happy with that win versus Limerick in Ennis, but ultimately it didn't mean anything in the end, because you lost the Munster final in the Gaelic rounds, I should say. Obviously, was where you beat them in the round robin. But yeah, look, ultimately, an okay season, but not a great one, I don't think, for Clare. And then we have Limerick, and look, it's obviously an A. I think that goes without saying. I think anything other than an A here would have been criminal. I mean, you could argue that they, in some ways, because obviously they won 4 in a row this year, but you could argue because of how the Munster Championship went, and the defeat to Clare and everything else, that maybe they slightly regressed. But look, I think you win the All-Ireland, that's the most important thing. And the way that Limerick done it was phenomenal. They came back from behind against Galway to beat them comfortably. They came back from Kilkenny 5 points down in the second half, scored 21 points in the second half. They're a phenomenal team, and I think you give them an A. If you could give more than an A, I certainly would. A+, whatever you want to say. Phenomenal performance this year from Limerick. They just, even with the injuries, even with Sean Finn, Declan Hannon missing, they still go on and win the All-Ireland, and they do it in style as well. Peter Casey, phenomenal in that second half. Aaron Gillan, hurler of the year in my opinion. Jeremy Burns, outstanding. Keane Lynch. You could just read out every player in this Limerick team and say how good they were. Nicky Quaid, outstanding. Dan Morrissey, what a year he had. But yeah, a phenomenal season for Limerick, and to think they won the treble. They won the league, they won the Munster Championship, and they won the All-Ireland. And to think there was moments this year and in the Munster Championship where they could have exited, and it's crazy to think what can happen. I often wonder if Tipperary had beaten Waterford, how differently would this championship season look? Look, I think Limerick would have beaten Galway in the quarterfinals, because they beat them in the semi-finals. They would have beaten Offaly, obviously, in the Joe McDonagh, and in the semi-finals they would have played Kilkenny, and you just don't know. Maybe they might have got caught. I don't think they would have, but we would have been looking at a different final, maybe a Limerick Galway or a Limerick Clare final. Who knows? But look, ultimately, it's all if buts, it's all hindsight, and Limerick turned up when it matters, and I think that's the most important thing. And I think whilst people with Limerick look at investment obviously into underage, or they look at the talent, the technical ability of these players, the mentality is so crucial in this Limerick side. The fact that they're able to turn it on when the going gets tough, it's the sign of a truly great team, and one of the greatest teams we have ever seen. So undoubtedly an A for Limerick. Tipperary will go for a C. Yeah, like I don't think there's been regression for Tipperary. I think obviously last year they lost every game in the Munster Championship, and it was a very bad season for Tipperary. Disappointed in the league as well. And obviously Colin Bonner got his marching orders and Liam Cahill came in. For Tipperary, things were going so right for so long. They got to the league semi-finals. They put up a great performance against Limerick in that semi-final. In Munster, they were very good. They drew at Limerick. They beat Waterford. They beat Clare, I think. Oh no, sorry, they didn't beat Waterford. They ultimately lost to Waterford, but they beat Clare. They drew with Cork, I think, as well. For Tipperary, things were going right for so long, and they were gunning towards the Munster final, and maybe would have even been slight favourites for that Munster final. But in the end, Waterford beat them, and they probably never really recovered after that. Like, they beat Offaly convincingly, and that was fine. You could say they were kind of expected to do that, and then they were very flat, weren't they, against Galway? They were very, very flat that day. It was a very disappointing performance, I felt, from a Tipperary perspective. Like, they have good players. They've obviously brought in a few younger players, obviously, this year. You still have the likes of Jake Morris and Jason Ford. Obviously, they've had a few injuries along the way. I think Tipperary, there has been progression, but I think ultimately losing that game against Waterford was such a definitive moment, in my opinion, in this year's championship season. And I think that game they'll look back at with huge regret, because their season could have been so much more different had they have won that game. And Waterford obviously were already, they were already gone at that point. But yeah, disappointment season for Tipperary in some ways, but I think ultimately there has been progression from last year, and I think they'll go into next year feeling like they're not a million miles away, whereas at the start of this year, they might have thought they were, but you look at it now and you think they're not a million miles away. I mean, they did draw with Limerick, so I think Tipperary, there has been progression, but maybe not a huge amount of progression as to what they would have wanted. And last but not least, from the senior sides, we have Waterford. Waterford definitely the closest to an F. I haven't given an F grade actually just yet, but I think Waterford, I'd probably give them a D ultimately. I don't know, Waterford fans can let me know in the comments down below, is a D, obviously last year they exited the Munster Championship in an early stage as well. They won the league. I think they are a very good team, Waterford. They do have a lot of very, very good players, as we very well know. Desi Hutchinson on his day, one of the most skillful hurlers in the country. He's outstanding. Jamie Barron, these lads, so many great players. Obviously, Tyg de Burke's injury was huge, and they've had a few other injuries, obviously, along the way as well. And the performance against Tipperary was so good. It was a great performance. It just kind of gave Waterford fans maybe a bit of hope towards the end of the season. A hard one to judge, a D or an F. Ultimately they did nothing in the league as well. They had a very disappointing league. It was the first year for Davy Fitz. I don't know, I think I'll edge towards a D. I think Munster is very competitive, and against Limerick on the opening day, they nearly beat them as well. They've done a lot right for large parts. So I think for Waterford I'll give a D. Maybe that's a little bit kind. I think they do have good players. Stephen Bennett, Jack Fagan, Billy Nolan, Neil Montgomery, obviously Patrick Fitzgerald who's come in as well. They have good players. I just hope next year that they let the shackles off a bit more and they go for it and play more suited to the style of hurling that Waterford are suited to play, which is on the front foot, attacking, move the ball quickly, and focus on the focus on attacking the opposition rather than just sitting in and trying to consolidate what you have, basically. So we'll go with a D for Waterford. A disappointing season, no doubt about it, but there were some positives obviously with that win versus Tipperary, and I don't think maybe they're as far off as what some people have been saying, in my opinion. But yeah, we'll give them a D. So we'll move on to the Joe McDonagh Cup sides then, and obviously it was Carlow who won the Joe McDonagh, and that was definitely something that hugely surprised me. I was expecting Carlow to probably be closer to relegation than promotion, in my opinion. When you think about it, in Division 2A they finished 4th. They won 2 out of their 5 games, and they were closer to relegation than they were ultimately getting out of Division 2A. But they were outstanding, absolutely outstanding in the Joe McDonagh. An unbelievable season. They win the title and, beating obviously Offaly in the final as well. You'd have to go for an A. Ultimately, fantastic season for Carlow. Brilliant season. And I think from a Carlow perspective next year, ultimately you can't ask for much more. The Joe McDonagh, that's the holy grail obviously for a lot of these teams. To get out of the championship, or to get out of Joe McDonagh and get into the Leinster Championship. And to think Carlow will be bringing the likes of Kilkenny or Galway to Netwatch Cullen Park next year which would be great for Carlow supporters. So yeah, A for Carlow. For Down, we'll go for a C. They won 1 game out of their 5 matches. They lost 4. They didn't do particularly brilliant, obviously, in Division 2A as well, but they did avoid relegation. They didn't win a game actually in the group stages, but thankfully enough, they did enough via score difference to stay up in the end. But look, ultimately for Down, I think like you looked at Division 2, or you looked at the John McDonough, and obviously Carlow, Offaly, Laois, Kerry, Kildare Down. You looked at how well Kildare looked in Division 2, and you thought it's going to be very tough for Down to get out of it. And ultimately, I thought they would be in the Christie Ring going into next year. So you have to give Down a huge amount of credit for staying up. They get that win versus Kildare, which ultimately is enough for them to stay up. Would you say there's been progression from last year? I don't think so. So I'll give them a C ultimately. But I do think the standard did improve around them. And I think for a county like Down, like ultimately obviously football is the number 1 sport there, and you know a lot of their good hurlers also play football. So ultimately for Down, look, solid season. They'll be very happy with it. Give them a C. As for Kerry, we'll give them a C as well. There definitely has been regression from last year. Like last year they were in the Joe McDonough Cup final and everything else. I think with Kerry though, there's one of them things where Kerry probably like, it's one of them from a Kerry perspective where obviously football is absolutely huge there, and Kerry have probably been pinching above their weight in hurling, like even to be in the Joe McDonough. Like that's not to be disrespectful, like that's a compliment, you know, that way. Like there was such a small pick of clubs down there. I know that the Kerry folk who are into hurling are mad into their hurling. I've definitely seen that from Commons and you know everything else down the years, but like yeah, we'll give them a C. Like ultimately, look, they finished with 5 points, 2 wins, a draw, and 2 defeats. They'll be disappointed not to have been in the Joe McDonough Cup final again. I think when you look at Carlow leapfrogging them, you know that they had the better of Carlow the last couple of years, and then Carlow have come along and obviously won the Joe McDonough. So I think from a Kerry perspective, there'll be moments of the season that they'll be disappointed with, but I think at the same time there'll be moments that you know they'll look at and think, ultimately, could we have given more with what we have? Probably not. But look, Shane Conway had a very good season, as we know. Like he's an outstanding hurler, and there has been a bit of movement in the team this year. So yeah, we'll go with a C for Kerry. Kildare, I'll go for a D. They were relegated from the Joe McDonough, but the league they actually had a wonderful season in the league. So they won 4 out of their 5 matches in Division 2A. They actually finished top of Division 2A on score difference, but they lost the promotion playoff to Offaly. So Offaly will be playing Division 1 hurling, and Kildare unfortunately won't be. So you'd look at that and think, wow, like what a season for Kildare. They've done so much, like outstanding performances. You know, some of the performances that Kildare obviously beat, like for example, they beat Carlow on the opening day of Division 2A by 25 points to 11. And to think like Carlow went on to win the Joe McDonough and Kildare went on to get relegated from the Joe McDonough. So I think for Kildare, the performance in the league was brilliant, but at the same time, to go back down to the Christie Ring, having shown that they're more than capable of competing with this level of opposition, it is a setback. It is a setback, and it will frustrate Kildare hurling fans and obviously Kildare management. And David Herity has since stepped away, so it'll be interesting to see who comes in there. There's a lot of potential with Kildare. There's good underage. I'll be convinced they'll win the Christie Ring next year, and they'll be in Division 2 again next year of the hurling league. So Kildare are definitely on the up, which is good to see. We need to see more teams in hurling improve, in my opinion, and sort of improve the standards and everything else. But I think for Kildare, they'll be disappointed with getting relegated. Like just having a look at it here, they lost every game as well. So like they'll be very disappointed with how their season went in the Joe McDonough. But the league, very good, but the Joe McDonough, not so much. So we'll give them a D. And then we have Laois, and this is where I give out my first F. So I've been quite kind maybe to a lot of teams so far, but I suppose when you look at the championship, it's kind of mad. Like every team won a game in the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship, like in provincial championships this year, which is definitely probably... I don't know if that's ever happened before, by the way. Like that's a very unusual statistic right there, that every team has won a game at least won one game. So for a team like Laois, who came down, who have been competing for so long in the Leinster Championship, like they have great players, and Patrick Purcell, Stephen Pickey-Marr, they've got a lot of great players, and they had some very disappointing performances in the Joe McDonough. They missed out obviously on even getting to the final, which I think was definitely a big setback. Like they got beaten quite comfortably on the opening day by Offaly, and that was ultimately what set them back and put them on the back foot from day one. And they got relegated from Division 1 as well, losing to Westmeath in that playoff and losing every game in Division 1B. You would look at it from a Laois perspective and you would say, like, ultimately, like, they gave so much for so long, staying in the Leinster Championship and being so competitive in the All-Ireland series. And I think ultimately maybe that era has slowly come to an end for Laois. I'm not entirely sure. I think they do have good players. They have a few players maybe to come in next year. But I think ultimately, it definitely has been a very disappointing season. I was expecting them to bounce straight back and come back up from the Joe McDonagh, especially with the players that they have. And they were beaten very convincingly a lot of the times this year. So I'll give them an F. It might maybe be a bit harsh, but I do think it was overall a quite disappointing season for Laois. So I'll give them an F. And last but not least, we have Offaly. So we'll give Offaly a B. Ultimately, they got out of Division 2, so they'll be playing Division 1 hurling next year, which is big for Offaly, obviously, to be back in Division 1 once again. But they lost, obviously, the Joe McDonagh Cup final. Like, they done so much right, but ultimately the aim, I think, at the start of the season would have been to win the Joe McDonagh. And they obviously, I think they lose to Carlow they lost to Carlow in the final, and they also lost to Carlow on the final day of round 5. Obviously that game didn't mean anything going into that, but yeah, look, it was after extra time. It was very, very close. Like, Carlow just about nicked it. I think Offaly have got a good, a lot of younger players in the side. Owen Cahill's obviously in there, Killian Sampson as well. They've got a good amount of underage coming through Offaly, where they were in the under 20 All-Ireland final, I think, as well. So like, Offaly have got a good amount of players coming through, and there's positive signs. There's positive signs for Offaly, and I've no doubt they'll get out of the John McDonagh. If not next year, maybe the year after. A lot of positives for Offaly to take, in my opinion, but ultimately we'll give them a B because they did lose that John McDonagh Cup final. I'm not going to grade any of the Christy Ring Cup teams or any of the teams below, just because I didn't really see any of them at all. And I think, like, you know what I mean? I know there's a lot of bluffing on this channel already, but I think there would be extreme bluffing. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think, Jesus, like, it'd be crazy if I was to grade some of these teams, having not seen any of them play ever, like, in the past few years, because obviously we never see any Christy Ring or Nicky Rackard or Laurie Marr games. But look, Meath won the Christy Ring. You'd give them an A. They're back in the Joe McDonagh Cup next year, which is obviously huge. Look, they had a fine day out in Croke Park, didn't they? Obviously beating Derry in the final. Sligo had a great year in the Christy Ring as well, in fairness. They were very close to getting into the final. London had a good season. Tyrone had a great season as well, considering they lost, obviously, the tragic death of Damien Casey last year. So Tyrone ultimately had a very good season, I think, as well, staying up in the Christy Ring. But yeah, we'll give Meath an A. Look, as I said, I don't know enough about these sides to grade them, but great season for Meath. So yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap this up here. Obviously, bear in mind, this is my opinion, but let me know if you do disagree in the comments down below. What would be your grades for some of the counties, obviously, that we've discussed today? And yeah, I will be doing one of these videos for football as well in the next couple of days, so stay tuned for that. My name is Aaron. Like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all later.